At Christmas dinner, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and vintage champagne, my billionaire grandmother leaned across the custom mahogany table and asked if I was still enjoying the $1.5 million historic brownstone she had purchased for me 5 years ago. I did not flinch, I did not drop my silver fork, I simply took a slow, elegant sip of my Cabernet, looked directly at my parents' suddenly pale, terrified faces, and calmly replied that I did not live in a brownstone, nor had I ever seen a single dime of that money. The silence that instantly suffocated the dining room was heavy, dangerous, and absolutely intoxicating. For 5 agonizing years, my family had secretly stolen my foundation to fund my sister's fraudulent, luxurious Instagram lifestyle, all while constantly mocking my clothes, my career, and my supposed poverty. They thought they had buried me alive. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy playing pretend, I had been quietly building a massive commercial real estate and private equity empire from the shadows. And before the dessert was even served, I was going to systematically, legally, and permanently evict them from their own lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to endure the agonizing pain of standing up to toxic family members who fundamentally underestimated your quiet strength and tried to play you for a fool. My name is Zora, I am 32 years old and I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Urban Holdings, a lucrative real estate development and private equity firm based in Atlanta. My professional existence revolves around identifying distressed commercial assets, auditing fraudulent financial portfolios, and acquiring amounts of yield debt. I am analytical, I am sharp as a scalpel, and I never ever let emotions dictate my strategic moves. You would think that a woman who handles million-dollar acquisitions for a living would be immune to the petty games of her own blood relatives. But the truth is, the most vicious betrayals always come from the people sitting right next to you at the dinner table. Growing up in a sprawling 8-bedroom mansion in one of Atlanta's most affluent, gated suburbs meant immense privilege to the outside world. But inside our home, emotional coldness and conditional love permeated every single corner. Our family dynamic was a toxic hierarchy built entirely on superficial appearances, and I was perpetually stationed at the absolute bottom. My mother, Valerie, was a woman who cared exclusively about social standing, designer labels, and what the wealthy congregation at our elite mega-church thought of her meticulously curated image. She viewed her children not as human beings to be nurtured, but as decorative accessories to be paraded around to boost her own fragile, insecure ego. She spent her days organizing charity galas she didn't actually care about and playing tennis at the country club. My father, Calvin, was a senior partner at a prominent corporate law firm. He was a man who loved the illusion of patriarchal control, but possessed absolutely none of the moral spine required to actually lead a family. He enabled my mother's worst impulses, always choosing the path of least resistance, which usually meant agreeing with whatever cruel narrative she was spinning on any given day. And then there was Chloe. At 30 years old, my younger sister was the undisputed golden child. Chloe had lighter skin, looser curls, and a personality perfectly molded to echo my mother's extreme vanity. Valerie looked at Chloe and saw the ultimate prize, a trophy daughter she could dress up in Chanel and parade around her elite social circles to prove she belonged. Chloe had never worked a real job in her entire life. She was essentially a professional socialite, obsessed with maintaining a pristine, heavily filtered online persona. I, on the other hand, was the designated scapegoat. I had darker skin, coarse natural hair, and a deeply introverted, fiercely independent personality that my mother found entirely repulsive. I didn't care about designer handbags, I didn't want to attend their vapid society brunches. I wanted to build things. From a young age, I was fascinated by architecture, urban planning, and the mechanics of real estate. But to Valerie, my authenticity was a massive liability. She constantly treated me like an embarrassing blemish on her perfect family portrait. The emotional abuse was constant, subtle, and exhausting. If Chloe wanted a new imported sports car for her birthday, my father would immediately wire the funds. If I needed help paying for a textbook in college, my mother would give me a 30-minute lecture on financial responsibility and tell me to get a third part-time job. I learned very early on that I was entirely on my own. When I graduated from university, I didn't ask them for a single favor. I moved into a tiny 200-square-foot studio apartment above a noisy 24-hour laundromat, and I went to work. The Thanksgiving dinner 2 years prior was a perfect example of their relentless cruelty. We were gathered around this exact same custom mahogany table. I was exhausted, having just pulled 3 all-nighters finalizing the blueprints for my very first independent commercial renovation project. I arrived wearing a simple, clean, unbranded linen dress, and my hair pulled back into a neat, professional bun. Chloe, meanwhile, was dripping in designer logos, sitting next to her new husband, DeAndre. DeAndre was 33, loud, arrogant, and practically bursting out of his tight, custom Italian suits. He styled himself as an elite venture capitalist and a high-yield hedge fund manager, though nobody could ever quite explain exactly what his firm actually produced. He spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords and crypto bro jargon. During that Thanksgiving dinner, Valerie had looked at my simple dress with absolute disgust. "I do not understand why you insist on looking so unkempt, Zora," she had announced loudly, ensuring all the extended relatives could hear. "We have an image to uphold in this community. Chloe manages to look breathtaking. Why can't you make a basic effort?" "Leave her alone, Mom," Chloe had said, offering a fake, condescending smile. "Zora works in those rundown, dirty neighborhoods all day, looking at broken concrete. You can't expect her to understand high fashion. She doesn't belong in our world." DeAndre had chuckled, swirling his expensive bourbon. "It's all about mindset, Zora," he had added smoothly, mansplaining to me across the table. "Some people are built for luxury, wealth, and high-level asset management. And some people are just built for the struggle. You just have to accept your lane. You're a worker bee. We are the architects of generational wealth." I had just smiled, taken a sip of water, and remained perfectly silent. I didn't tell them that earlier that morning, I had officially closed a massive deal to acquire and redevelop an entire abandoned industrial block downtown. I didn't tell them that my net worth had just surpassed DeAndre's fake portfolio by several $1 million. I let them enjoy their delusion. I let them think I was a struggling, pathetic peasant. Because the golden rule of real estate and revenge is exactly the same. Always let your opponents severely underestimate your capital until the contract is signed. But the absolute breaking point, the moment I realized that their casual cruelty had crossed the line into actual, malicious financial warfare, happened exactly 8 months ago. I was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled office of a senior commercial loan officer at a major national bank. I was applying for a massive 8-figure development loan to fund Vanguard Urban Holdings' latest acquisition. It was a routine meeting. I had excellent credit, flawless corporate records, and millions in verifiable liquid assets. The loan officer, a middle-aged man named Richard, was reviewing my background check when he suddenly frowned, tapping his pen against his desk. "Mims, Wilson," he said, looking slightly confused. "Your corporate financials are impeccable. However, our system flagged a massive, irregular withdrawal from your personal profile, linked to the Wilson Family Trust. Since you are listed as a primary beneficiary, any movement of funds over $1 million triggers a standard compliance review." I kept my face perfectly neutral, though my heart rate immediately spiked. "A withdrawal?" I asked calmly. "Can you provide the specific details of that transaction, Richard?" He turned his monitor slightly. "Yes, 5 years ago, exactly 3 days after your 27th birthday, an incoming wire of $1. 5 million was deposited directly into the trust, explicitly earmarked under your legal name. However, 48 hours later, your father, Calvin Wilson, acting as the trust executor, authorized a complete withdrawal of those exact funds. The money was transferred into a private corporate holding account. We just need you to verify that this was an authorized transfer on your behalf, before we can clear this commercial loan." The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stared at the screen, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. My family hadn't just been emotionally abusive, They hadn't just favored Chloe and ignored me. They had actively, deliberately stolen $1.5 million that belonged to me. Yes, Richard, I said smoothly, not missing a single beat. That was a planned, authorized family investment. Please proceed with the loan approval. I walked out of that bank with my 8-figure loan secured. But my entire perspective on my family had fundamentally permanently shifted. I didn't confront them immediately. I didn't call my father screaming. I didn't drive to their mansion and demand answers. I am a forensic auditor by nature. I don't operate on emotion. I operate on hard, undeniable data. For the next 8 months, I weaponized my entire corporate infrastructure. I hired the most ruthless private investigators and forensic accountants in the state. I pulled public records, offshore shell company registrations, and complex wire transfer logs. I traced every single penny of that $15 million, and what I uncovered was a web of fraud, desperate vanity, and absolute financial incompetence so staggering it almost made me laugh. They hadn't invested my money, they had fed it into a burning furnace to maintain an illusion. And so I waited. I stayed completely silent. I attended their minor family functions, wearing my simple clothes, letting them mock my career, letting Chloe brag about her new imported cars, and letting DeAndre lecture me about generational wealth. I absorbed every insult, every condescending smirk, and every cruel joke. I absorbed it all because I knew that the perfect stage was being set. Which brings us to last night, Christmas Eve, the ultimate high society dinner at the Wilson estate. The house was aggressively decorated, looking more like a luxury hotel lobby than a home. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered food, imported pine, and suffocating entitlement. Valerie was practically vibrating with nervous energy, ensuring every crystal glass was polished to perfection. The reason for her extreme anxiety was seated directly across from me. Beatrice, Big B, my grandmother. At 78 years old, Grandma B was a living legend and a sheer force of nature. She was a self-made billionaire who had built a massive, globally recognized hair care empire back in the 1970s. She started mixing formulas in her kitchen sink while working 2 jobs and had ruthlessly expanded it into a worldwide enterprise. Grandma B did not tolerate fools, she did not tolerate fake wealth, and she certainly did not tolerate disrespect. She had flown in from Chicago on her private jet specifically for this dinner, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored emerald green pantsuit and a vintage diamond necklace. Her mind was as sharp and unforgiving as a steel trap. Valerie was desperate for Grandma B's approval, hovering around her like a nervous servant. Chloe and DeAndre were putting on a sickeningly sweet performance, trying to project the image of a wildly successful, elite power couple. I sat at the far end of the table wearing a tailored but understated black cashmere sweater and simple trousers. I watched the entire charade play out in silence. The turkey is absolutely exquisite. Valerie, DeAndre announced loudly, raising his glass of expensive champagne. But of course, we only expect the best from this household. It's exactly the standard Chloe and I maintain at our new estate in Buckhead. Valerie beamed with pride. Thank you, DeAndre. Chloe has always had such refined taste. She is truly the jewel of this family. She elevates our social standing wherever she goes. My mother then turned her gaze toward me, her smile instantly souring into a familiar sneer. It's a shame Zora still refuses to learn basic etiquette. I told you this was a formal dinner, Zora. You look like you just walked off a dirty construction site. You're lucky we even invite you to these events. Pity goes a long way. I didn't react. I just cut a small piece of my prime rib, maintaining absolute, freezing eye contact with her. Grandma B had been watching the entire exchange with narrowed, calculating eyes. She hadn't said much all evening, letting the toxic dynamics reveal themselves. Suddenly, she picked up her heavy silver spoon and clinked it sharply against her crystal water glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the ambient jazz music and the quiet chatter. The table instantly fell dead. Silent, everyone turned their full attention to the matriarch. Valerie plastered on a desperate, eager smile, clearly expecting a compliment about the extravagant decor or the expensive catering. But Grandma B completely ignored Valerie. Her sharp, intelligent gaze bypassed my parents. bypassed the golden child and locked directly onto me. Zora baby, Grandma B said, her voice rich, deep, and carrying an undeniable, terrifying weight of authority. Yes, Grandma, I replied politely. Are you still living comfortably in that $15 million historic brownstone I bought for you 5 years ago? The dining room went completely, utterly silent. The jovial, condescending energy that had filled the space evaporated into thin air. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. My father Calvin had just taken a sip of his wine. He suddenly stopped chewing, his eyes widening in sheer panic. He began to cough violently, practically choking on the liquid, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. Valerie looked as though someone had just physically struck her with a baseball bat. All the color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her flawless elite exterior shattered right before my eyes. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless gasp came out. I paused my fork, letting it hover halfway to my mouth. I blinked, projecting an image of genuine, innocent confusion. I looked at Grandma B, then slowly turned my head to look at my hyperventilating parents. What house, Grandma? I asked, my voice steady, clear, and perfectly bewildered. I don't live in a historic brownstone. I rent a modest apartment in the city. I've been paying my own rent for years. I haven't received a single dollar from the trust since I turned 18. The silence that followed my words was so thick it felt like physical pressure. It was a heavy, dangerous, suffocating kind of quiet. Grandma B leaned back slowly in her antique chair. Her expression hardened into something cold, ruthless, and entirely unforgiving. Her voice dropped to a lethal register that sent a shiver down everyone's spine. Calvin, Valerie, she began, addressing them with a tone that demanded immediate compliance. 5 years ago, when Zora turned 27, I personally wired $1.5 million into the family trust account. I sent explicit, legally binding instructions that those funds were to be used to purchase a debt-free historic property for Zora. It was meant to serve as her permanent home and her initial start-up capital, so she could build her business with security. Grandma B slammed her hand flat against the mahogany table. The sudden violent noise made Chloe physically jump out of her seat. Where is the money? Grandma B demanded, her voice echoing like thunder. Where is my granddaughter's house? Calvin frantically wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, actively avoiding eye contact with his furious mother. His hands were shaking so badly he knocked over a salt shaker. Mom, there was a misunderstanding, Calvin stammered, his voice weak, pathetic, and defensive. The real estate market was highly volatile at that time. Commercial properties were crashing. We wanted to protect Zora from making a poor investment. We thought letting a professional handle the funds was safer. Before Calvin could dig his grave any deeper, DeAndre stepped in. He buttoned his tight suit jacket and flashed his signature, fake venture capitalist smile. He was arrogant enough to believe he could charm and outsmart a self-made billionaire who could buy and sell his entire existence 10 times over. Now Grandma B, let's not overreact here, DeAndre said smoothly, holding his hands up in a placating, condescending gesture. Calvin and Valerie made the responsible parental decision. Zora completely lacks financial literacy. She designs floor plans for abandoned laundromats. Giving her that much liquid capital would have been an absolute disaster. She would have blown it on charity or lost it in a bad neighborhood. DeAndre puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of himself. So, they entrusted the funds to me. I managed the money through my private equity firm. We integrated it into our high-yield growth portfolios to grow it safely. The money is perfectly safe, it's invested. Chloe nodded vigorously, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as she immediately defended her husband's honor. DeAndre is right, Grandma. Zora doesn't know how to manage real wealth. DeAndre actually saved her from bankruptcy. We're keeping it safe for her until she's mature enough to handle it. We are practically doing her a massive favor. I sat still, absorbing the sheer breathtaking magnitude of their delusion. For 5 years they had maliciously hidden an inheritance from me. They had watched me struggle, They had watched me ride the bus in the rain. They had watched me eat cheap meals while working 80-hour weeks. They had allowed me to believe I was unsupported, all while sitting on a fortune that was legally mine. I carefully placed my linen napkin on the table. I wiped my mouth. I looked directly at DeAndre, feeling a massive surge of cold, focused power wash over me. The time for silence was over. I smiled. It was a terrifying, dead-eyed smile, safely invested. I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy tension like a straight razor. That is a fascinating choice of words, DeAndre. Did you safely invest it in the market? Or did you use my stolen inheritance to quietly settle the massive federal lawsuits from your last failed crypto scam? Valerie slammed her manicured hand against the custom mahogany dining table with such terrifying force that the expensive crystal wine glasses violently rattled against each other. The deep crimson liquid splashed over the gold-rimmed edge of my father's glass, staining the pristine white linen tablecloth like fresh blood. Instead of apologizing for the blatant, undeniable theft of my $1.5 million inheritance, my mother went on the immediate offensive. This was her signature move. Whenever Valerie was backed into a corner, whenever her carefully constructed lies were threatened with exposure, she attacked viciously. She pushed her heavy antique chair back and stood up, towering over the holiday feast. Her eyes were blazing with a toxic mix of sudden panic and pure unadulterated venom. "How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way?" Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. "You have absolutely no idea how the real world works, Zora. You sit there in your cheap, unbranded clothes, with your unkempt, natural locks looking like a common street vendor. And you have the audacity to question our financial decisions." She pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face. "You want to know why we didn't just hand you that money? I'll tell you exactly why. Because you do not belong in our world, you never have." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I didn't flinch as her cruel words sliced through the air. Beside me, my grandmother, Beatrice, watched the scene unfold in stone-cold silence, her sharp eyes missing absolutely nothing. Valerie gestured wildly toward my sister Chloe, who was busy nervously adjusting her massive diamond tennis necklace as if to ensure everyone was still looking at it. "Look at your sister," my mother demanded. "Chloe and DeAndre elevate this family. They host elite charity galas. They are board members of the most exclusive social chapters in Atlanta. They sit at tables with senators and real estate moguls. They bring prestige to our name. What do you do, Zora? You spend your days walking through run-down, dilapidated neighborhoods, playing in the dirt, trying to save inner-city buildings that should have been bulldozed decades ago. You drag our legacy straight back to the hood." My father, Calvin, stared down at his plate of honey-glazed ham. He was too much of a coward to meet my gaze and far too weak to stop his wife's abusive tirade. Chloe simply smiled, a smug, deeply satisfied smirk playing on her glossy lips. She loved this. She had always thrived on my degradation. It was the only way she knew how to feel important. Why on earth would we give $1.5 million to a girl who insists on living like a peasant? Valerie continued, her voice reaching a hysterical crescendo. DeAndre took that money and used it to buy Chloe a breathtaking estate in Buckhead. A home worthy of our social standing. A home where they can host the elite members of our community. That money was put to work to elevate our family name, not to be wasted on your pathetic little urban renewal fantasies. You should be on your knees, thanking us for protecting the family wealth from your incompetence." The air in the room was thick, suffocatingly heavy, with the sheer weight of her prejudice and delusion. She had just openly confessed to grand larceny in front of a billionaire and tried to wrap her crime in a bow of upper-class elitism. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I simply picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and locked eyes with the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "Elevate the family?" I asked, my tone dangerously calm and completely unbothered. "Let's call this exactly what it is, Mother. You didn't steal my future to elevate the family. You stole my future to fund Chloe's fake Instagram lifestyle. Because she perfectly fits your sick, twisted, colorist narrative. Valerie gasped, taking a dramatic step back as if I had physically struck her across the face. Don't act shocked, I continued, my voice steady and cutting like broken glass. We are going to speak the ugly truth today. You have spent your entire life obsessed with proximity, to whiteness and fake high society validation. You look at Chloe, with her lighter skin and her looser curl pattern, and you see the ultimate prize. You see a shiny trophy you can parade around your elite country clubs to prove you belong. But you look at me, with my dark skin and my coarse hair, and you see a threat to your carefully curated social climbing. The room was so quiet you could hear the firewood crackling in the hearth. You didn't invest in Chloe, I stated coldly. You bought a prop, you bought a human billboard to advertise your desperate, pathetic need for validation. Chloe slammed her manicured hands on the table, her face turning a blotchy, furious red. Shut your mouth, Zora, she yelled. You are just jealous because I am the one living the luxury life while you are struggling in some tiny, miserable apartment. You have always been jealous of me. I turned my gaze to my sister, offering her a smile of pure, concentrated pity. Jealous of you, Chloe? I asked softly, shaking my head. Why would I ever be jealous of a woman who can't even afford the diamonds around her own neck? You are 30 years old, and still playing dress-up with stolen funds. You have no career, no ambition, and absolutely no identity outside of the fraudulent wealth your husband supposedly provides. I have spent the last 5 years building my own life with my own 2 hands. I know the exact value of $1 because I actually earned mine. You just spent mine. Valerie opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but she was quickly interrupted by the loud scrape of a heavy wooden chair against the floor. DeAndre stood up. He buttoned the center button of his bespoke Italian suit, aggressively puffing out his chest as he tried to physically intimidate me from across the table. He stood at 6'3", a man entirely used to using his size and his loud, booming voice to bully women into submission. Now you listen to me, Zora, DeAndre commanded, using that deep corporate tone he used to manipulate his naive clients. You are way out of your depth here. You are talking about things you fundamentally do not understand. Private equity, hedge funds, high-yield asset management. This is a grown man's game. You design floor plans for abandoned laundromats. You don't know the first thing about generating generational wealth. He began to pace slowly behind Chloe's chair, gesturing widely with his hands like a professor lecturing a slow student. When your father came to me with the trust money, I did what any top-tier financial expert would do. I integrated it into a high-yield growth portfolio. I took that stagnant capital and I put it to work in the market. My fund consistently yields a 30% return year over year. Do you even know what that means, Zora? It means I am practically printing money. I am creating a massive financial fortress for this family that your little community projects could never touch in 100 lifetimes. Grandma B watched DeAndre with a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust, her hands resting heavily on her cane. Calvin was visibly sweating now, pulling nervously at his silk collar, as if the room had suddenly become a sauna. He knew the truth, and he knew DeAndre was digging them all into a massive, inescapable grave. You lack financial literacy, Zora, DeAndre continued, stopping to lean over the table and point directly at my face. You let your emotions cloud your business judgment. If your father had given you that $1.5 million, you would have blown it on charity. You would have sunk it into some failing neighborhood and lost every single dime. I took that capital and I multiplied it. Chloe's estate in Buckhead is a rapidly appreciating asset. The cars, the jewelry, the elite social connections we've built, those are all strategic investments. We are playing chess while you are playing checkers. He sneered, a look of pure arrogant triumph plastered on his face. So, instead of sitting here ruining Christmas dinner with your jealous whining about a house you never deserved, you should be on your knees thanking me. I am the one carrying this family into the top 1%. You should be deeply grateful we even let you sit at this table. The dining room fell silent again, save for the crackling of the fireplace in the background. DeAndre stood tall, looking extremely pleased with his own delusional monologue. Chloe looked up at him with utter adoration, fully buying into his fraudulent narrative. Valerie nodded approvingly, her confidence returning as she felt validated by her son-in-law's aggressive mansplaining. Even my father, Calvin, managed a weak, terrified smile, desperately trying to cling to the lie DeAndre was spinning. I let the silence stretch for a long, incredibly uncomfortable moment. I took a slow sip of my water, savoring the cool liquid, feeling the crisp chill slide down my throat. I enjoyed letting them feel victorious for those final few seconds. I watched the arrogant pride swell in their chests. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought their loud voices, expensive clothes, and corporate buzzwords could intimidate me into shrinking back into the shadows. They thought I was still the powerless girl they had trampled over for years. Then I smoothly reached down to the hardwood floor beside my chair. I unzipped my vintage leather tote bag and deliberately pulled out my tablet. I tapped the glass screen, entering my secure passcode, and brought up the official, highly classified federal document I had downloaded just hours before arriving at this wretched holiday dinner. I rested the tablet gently on the table next to my plate. I looked back up at DeAndre, locking onto his eyes. The arrogant smirk was still plastered across his face, but a tiny, barely perceptible flicker of uncertainty now twitched in his jaw. "A 30% return?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing sharply in the quiet room. "That is truly fascinating, DeAndre, a financial miracle, really. So tell me, if your private equity fund is yielding such massive, historic returns, why did your firm file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in federal court at exactly 8 a.m. yesterday morning?" I didn't wait for DeAndre to find his voice. I tapped the screen-sharing icon on my iPad. He bought me the Buckhead estate with his own profits. "You are just trying to embarrass us because Grandma is here." I swiped to the next slide. A massive resolution wire transfer receipt filled the entire screen. "Look at the date, Chloe," I commanded, my voice echoing with authority. "Look at the originating and receiving routing numbers. This shows a direct authorized transfer of $1.5 million from the Wilson Family Trust directly into DeAndre's personal holding company." 48 hours later, DeAndre wired $800 thousand dues to an exotic auto dealership to purchase your 2 custom Mercedes G-Wagons, your imported sports car, and all the designer bags you've been flaunting on Instagram. I swiped again, bringing up 5 separate bank drafts. The remaining $700 thousand was immediately dispersed to 5 angry, high-net-worth investors who were actively threatening to report DeAndre to the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraud. "He didn't buy your cars with his elite market profits, Chloe. He bought them with my stolen startup capital." Chloe stared at the massive screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She looked down at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, suddenly realizing with horrific clarity that it was bought with stolen money. DeAndre tried to reach for her arm, but she slapped his hand away, her eyes wild with panic. "You knew about this?" Grandma B asked. Her voice was no longer loud, it was a terrifying, deadly whisper. She clutched her cane with both hands, leaning heavily against it, her knuckles stark white. "How long have you known they stole your money, Zora?" I turned to my grandmother, softening my expression just a fraction. "I found out exactly 8 months ago," I replied calmly. "I stayed completely quiet because I needed undeniable proof. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went in this family before I exposed it. I needed to know who was complicit." Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her hands fluttered nervously around her neck, clutching at her expensive pearls. "This is a mistake, Calvin." Valerie cried out. "Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them DeAndre promised to pay it back with interest. We only lent him the money temporarily. We had a verbal agreement." "Lent him the money?" Grandma B repeated slowly, turning her terrifying gaze toward my father. Calvin sat completely paralyzed at the head of the table. The confident, arrogant patriarch who loved to lecture me about upholding the family image was now sweating profusely through his custom-tailored silk shirt. His hands were clamped tightly over his knees. "You took the money I explicitly set aside for your daughter. Grandma B said, her voice dripping with venom. The daughter you threw away to the wolves, and you gave it to this con artist. You handed him her future. Mom, please understand, Calvin begged, his voice cracking under the intense, crushing pressure of his mother's glare. DeAndre showed me his spreadsheets. He showed me the projected returns. He told me he was on the verge of taking his company public. He said if he just had a quick injection of capital, he could double the family trust in 6 months. I was trying to grow our wealth. I was doing it for the family. You did it because you are a weak, gullible fool who wanted to impress his country club friends. Grandma B spat out, looking at him with absolute disgust. You sacrificed Zora to fund Chloe's fake prestige. And when the money disappeared, you hid it like a coward. I tapped my iPad one more time. Another document appeared on the television screen. This one had the official letterhead of a major national bank. But that is not the worst part, is it, Dad? I asked, stepping closer to Calvin. The entire room froze. When DeAndre burned through my $15 million, it still wasn't enough to keep his fraudulent company afloat. I explained to the captivated audience. The angry investors kept coming. The federal lawsuits started piling up. DeAndre came crying to you again, begging for another massive bailout to keep himself out of federal prison. Calvin closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly as if trying to physically deny the truth displayed on the glowing screen above him. His breathing was ragged, sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Tell them what you did, Dad, I demanded, my voice echoing off the walls. Tell them exactly how you saved your precious son-in-law. Calvin buried his face in his hands. A loud, wretched sob escaped his throat, destroying whatever dignity he had left. When the fund collapsed, DeAndre told me the SEC was preparing to indict him. Calvin confessed, the words pouring out in a pathetic, broken rush. He said if he went to prison, Chloe would be ruined. The family name would be dragged through the mud. I couldn't let that happen. We have a reputation in Atlanta. I had to protect Chloe. So you committed financial suicide, I stated flatly, pointing to the bank document on the screen. When Calvin refused to speak, I read the document aloud for the room. 6 months ago, Calvin Wilson took out a massive interest commercial mortgage against this very estate. The house we are currently eating Christmas dinner in, right now. You leveraged the entire family legacy to borrow $3 million in cash. You handed all $3 million directly to DeAndre to quietly settle his pending lawsuits and pay off the rest of his investors. You thought you could cover it up before Grandma B found out. You thought DeAndre would miraculously make the money back. Valerie screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She grabbed Calvin's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into his suit jacket. You mortgaged the house. Valerie shrieked, violently shaking him. You put a lien on my home? Calvin, tell me she is lying. Tell me we still own this house. Calvin refused to look at her. He just kept his face buried in his hands, weeping openly. The money is gone, Valerie, Calvin choked out. DeAndre lost it all in a bad options trade trying to win it back. We are completely broke. We can't make the monthly payments. The bank sent the default notice last week. Grandma B moved with astonishing speed for a woman of 78. She raised her hand and delivered a stinging, open-handed slap directly across Calvin's cheek. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the dining room. You disgust me, she hissed. You ruined this family to protect a thief. Calvin, desperate, humiliated, and backed into an impossible corner, suddenly stood up. His cheek was bright red and his eyes were wild with cornered rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, his face twisted in malice. Fine, we lost it all, Calvin roared, spit flying from his mouth. But that means you get nothing, Zora. The bank is foreclosing on me anyway. The bank is taking everything. So you can stand there and act superior, but you still lose. You are never getting your $1.5 million back. The bank owns this house, not you. I didn't break eye contact. I slowly poured myself a glass of my grandmother's expensive red wine, letting the silence build to an excruciating level. I took a slow sip, enjoying the rich, complex flavor, feeling completely, utterly in control. Then I smirked, offering my father a look of absolute, chilling triumph. "You are right, Dad," I said smoothly. "The bank did own the house, but do you know which private equity firm the bank just sold your toxic debt to?" Valerie barked a sharp, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. She stood up so quickly, her heavy wooden chair nearly toppled backward onto the Persian rug. "You are bluffing," Valerie shouted, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You are sitting there lying through your teeth, just to ruin our holiday. You know absolutely nothing about private equity firms or bank debt. You are a college dropout who plays in the dirt with contractors." I took a slow breath, letting her desperation fill the room. My mother was unraveling, her carefully constructed reality shattering piece by piece. "You abandoned the prestigious corporate internship we secured for you," Valerie continued, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "You threw away a perfectly good path to go work in some filthy community center. And now you want us to believe you have insider knowledge of high-level financial transactions. It's pathetic, Zora. You are pathetic. You are just angry because you are broke and jealous of your sister." Calvin eagerly grabbed onto his wife's delusional lifeline. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and forced a weak, condescending chuckle. "Your mother is right," Calvin said, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. "The bank doesn't just share confidential mortgage data with random struggling real estate developers. Commercial debt sales are handled exclusively behind closed doors by massive institutional investors. You don't have the security clearance or the network to know anything about my mortgage. You probably just read an article about DeAndre's firm filing for bankruptcy and decided to make up a story to scare us." They were scrambling. They were desperately trying to stuff the genie back into the bottle, clinging to the familiar, comforting narrative that I was just the incompetent black sheep. If they could just reduce me to the struggling disappointment they always claimed I was, then maybe their world wouldn't collapse entirely. I didn't even bother to raise my voice to defend myself. I just sat there and let them talk in circles. I wanted them to exhaust their denial. I wanted them to drain every last ounce of their fake confidence before I delivered the final, fatal blow. "You have spent the last 5 years embarrassing this family," Valerie added, her eyes flashing with venom. "You show up to charity galas in off-the-rack dresses. You refuse to join our country club. You deliberately associate with people who have zero social standing. We tried to groom you for success, but you insisted on dragging yourself through the mud. And now you expect us to believe you are some kind of financial mastermind holding the keys to our estate? It is a joke. You are a joke." Calvin nodded vigorously. "We are done entertaining this absolute nonsense," he declared, attempting to summon his lost patriarchal authority. "You can leave now, Zora. This dinner is over for you. Get out of my house." But the illusion of control was already dead. Chloe hadn't heard a single word of our parents' desperate denial. Her wide, panicked eyes were locked entirely on her husband. Her perfect world of luxury, designer bags, and social media dominance was burning down around her, and she knew it. "You lied to me!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she shoved her chair away from the table. She rounded on DeAndre, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. "You told me your fund was making millions. You told me the Buckhead estate was paid off in cash. Are you telling me my entire life is funded by a Ponzi scheme?" DeAndre took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. "Chloe baby, listen to me," he pleaded, his smooth venture capitalist persona completely vanishing. "It was just a temporary cash flow problem. The market shifted unexpectedly. I just needed a little bridge capital to tide the firm over until the next quarter." "A temporary problem?" Chloe shrieked, striking him hard on the chest with both hands. "You filed for bankruptcy. You stole my sister's money to buy my car. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? My friends are going to find out. The country club board will laugh at me. You have made me a laughingstock. I am going to be broke." DeAndre dropped his facade. The suave, loving husband act vanished instantly, revealing the cowardly opportunist underneath. He violently swatted Chloe's hands away and shoved her backward. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the mahogany table. "Shut your mouth," DeAndre yelled, his face turning a blotchy red. "You didn't seem to care where the money came from when you were swiping your black card in Paris. You loved spending the cash. You loved the jewelry and the cars. Don't act like some innocent victim now." He spun around and pointed an accusing finger at Calvin. "And you," DeAndre spat, glaring at my father. "Don't stand there pretending I forced you to do anything. You are a greedy old fool. You practically begged me to take your money. You handed over Zora's trust fund because I promised you a 20% kickback off the books. And when the funds started bleeding, you voluntarily mortgaged this house because you were terrified Grandma B would find out you lost her initial investment. You signed those bank papers, Calvin. You handed me that $3 million. You are just as guilty as I am." Calvin's face contorted with fury. "I trusted you," he roared, lunging forward. "I mortgaged my legacy to save you from federal prison, and you blew it on bad trades. You ruined my life." The dining room descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The perfect, elite family dynamic they had projected for decades shattered into a million jagged pieces. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, screaming about her ruined reputation. Calvin and DeAndre were standing chest to chest, shouting obscenities and blaming each other for the financial ruin they had co-authored. Valerie was running between them, screaming for everyone to stop, desperately trying to protect her expensive crystal glasses from being knocked off the table in the scuffle. I remained firmly in my seat. I reached across the table, grabbed the heavy crystal decanter, and calmly poured myself a fresh glass of Grandma B's Reserve Cabernet. The rich dark red wine swirled beautifully in the glass. I took a slow, appreciative sip. The taste of victory was sweet, cold, and incredibly satisfying. Beside me, Grandma B sat perfectly still. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't intervening. She was just watching the carnage with cold, hard eyes, leaning heavily on her silver-handled cane. She briefly glanced at me, and a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. She recognized exactly what I was doing. I let them scream until their throats were raw. I let them tear each other apart like wild animals fighting over scraps. When the shouting finally began to die down into exhausted, heavy panting, I set my wineglass down with a sharp clink. The sound cut through their heavy breathing. "You spent the last 5 years playing dress-up," I said, my voice quiet but carrying effortlessly across the ruined dinner table. "You wore stolen diamonds and drove stolen cars. You bought a fake life with my money and spent every waking moment trying to convince the world you were royalty." They all turned to look at me, their faces flushed and streaked with sweat. "But while you were busy posing for cameras and playing pretend, I was actually working," I continued, my voice steady and relentless. "When you cut me off and left me to starve, I didn't cry. I went to work. I spent 5 years grinding in the commercial real estate market. I spent sleepless nights negotiating deals in dingy 24-hour diners. I built a network of contractors, investors, and city planners. I bought up abandoned commercial districts that people like you turned your noses up at. I renovated them. I revitalized entire city blocks while you were busy stealing from your own blood." Valerie stared at me, her chest heaving. "You expect us to believe you built an empire from nothing?" She sneered, though her voice lacked its earlier venom. "I expect you to realize that you completely underestimated the person you spent your life abusing," I replied smoothly. "You thought denying me money would break me. You thought I needed your country club connections to survive. But being the black sheep of this family was the greatest gift you ever gave me. It taught me how to survive in the dirt. It taught me how to build from the ground up. You stole my starting line, but you could never steal my hustle." Valerie's eyes darted frantically around the room. She was backed into a corner, completely stripped of her wealth, her pride, and her delusions. Desperate to regain the upper hand, she slammed her hands flat onto the mahogany table. "It doesn't matter who bought the debt," Valerie screamed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. I still have the promissory note you signed when you were 22. You owe us $100,000, and I will sue you for every single penny. I laughed out loud, a bright, genuinely amused sound. You mean the note you forged? Valerie's hand shook violently as she reached into her quilted Chanel bag. She bypassed her designer lipstick and compact, pulling out a crisp, neatly folded piece of paper. She slammed it onto the table so hard, her heavy diamond rings clacked sharply against the polished wood. This is your signature, she declared, her voice vibrating with a manic, desperate triumph. You came to us begging for seed money when your pathetic little startup was failing. We lent you $100,000, and the note clearly states it is payable upon demand. We are calling the note due today, Zora. So if anyone is going bankrupt and losing everything, it is you. I leaned forward, bracing my forearms casually on the edge of the table. I didn't even bother picking up the piece of paper. I just stared at the date printed at the top right corner in bold black ink. October 14th, 2019. A masterpiece of legal fiction, I said, looking up to meet her panicked, wide-eyed gaze. There is just one glaring problem with your timeline, Mother. It is your exact signature. She snapped, jabbing her index finger at the bottom line. Don't try to lie your way out of this. You owe us this money. It is a digital trace of my signature lifted straight from a college loan application you kept in your files. I corrected her, my tone dropping to a dead, icy calm. On October 14th, 2019, I was not sitting in your immaculate study begging for a handout. I was unconscious in the intensive care unit at Emory University Hospital. Valerie's jaw snapped shut with an audible click. The blood drained from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking stark and unnatural against her suddenly pale skin. Remember that week? I asked, the words slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. I had double pneumonia, my lungs were filling with fluid. I was intubated for 3 straight days, fighting for my life, unable to speak or move. Do you know how I know you remember? Because the hospital billing department called you, my designated emergency contact, to ask for an insurance copay. And you told the admissions nurse that I was a college dropout who was no longer your financial responsibility. And you hung up the phone. Calvin shifted his gaze to the floor, staring at the intricate floral patterns of the rug, completely unable to look at me or his mother. I couldn't breathe on my own, let alone hold a pen to sign a fraudulent promissory note. I continued, tapping the piece of paper with my finger. But please, Mother, take this to court. I would absolutely love to watch a federal judge cross-reference this date with my official medical records, and then ask why you tried to extort $100,000 from your own daughter to cover your son-in-law's criminal gambling debts. We were teaching you a lesson, Valerie stammered, her voice dropping to a desperate, reedy whisper. She looked frantically around the room for support, hoping Calvin or Chloe would step in, but found none. You've refused to listen to us. You refused to take the corporate job your father arranged for you. You had to learn how the real world works. You had to hit rock bottom to understand our value and respect our authority. Oh, I learned, I shot back, my voice rising with a controlled, righteous heat that made her flinch. I learned exactly how the real world works when they discharged me with an oxygen tank and an $80,000 medical bill. You thought that debt would break me. You thought I would come crawling back to this house, on my hands and knees, begging to answer phones at Dad's firm, just to keep the collection agencies from destroying my credit score. We left the door open for you, Calvin muttered to his shoes, his voice weak and defensive, lacking any of his usual bravado. All you had to do was apologize and fall in line. You always had to be so incredibly stubborn. Fall in line to fund this fake empire? I scoffed, gesturing widely around the lavish, suffocating room, pointing at the crystal chandelier and the imported art. No thanks. While you two were busy buying Chloe her 3rd engagement ring upgrade to post on social media, I was living in a 200-square-foot studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. I ate generic rice and beans for 18 straight months. I rode the city bus in the freezing rain to every commercial zoning meeting in Atlanta, until the city planners knew me by my first name. Chloe crossed her arms defensively, her tear-streaked face twisting into a bitter scowl. Nobody asked you to be a martyr, Zora. You chose to live like trash. That was your own stupid decision. And nobody asked you to be a parasite, yet here we are, I snapped, silencing her instantly as she shrank back into her chair. I turned back to my parents, the anger I had buried for 5 long years finally boiling to the surface. You cut off my phone, you took me off the health insurance, you went to the bank and intentionally removed your names as guarantors on my student loans, the day before my senior year tuition was due. You systematically tried to starve me out of my own future so I would be forced to submit to your absolute control. Valerie gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white against the wood. We gave you life, Zora. We put a roof over your head. You owe us your respect. And then you tried to ruin my life because I wouldn't be your obedient puppet, I replied, feeling an immense, liberating weight lift off my shoulders with every word. Every time I pitched a development project, I had to work 10 times harder because the Wilson name was suddenly a massive liability. Dad, you actually called my first major investor behind my back and told him I was mentally unstable. You tried to tank my first commercial deal just to teach me a lesson and keep me firmly in my place. Calvin finally looked up, his eyes defensive and watery. I was protecting a colleague from a bad investment. You were 24 with zero capital and no proven track record. I was 24, with a better business plan than you ever had in your entire life. I fired back, leaning in close so he could see the absolute conviction in my eyes. And that investor ignored you. He saw my vision and he gave me the seed money anyway. I flipped that abandoned warehouse into a tech hub that sold for $4 million. I built a thriving firm out of the dirt you threw on me. I don't owe you a dime, I don't owe you an apology, and I certainly don't owe you a single ounce of my respect. The sharp, authoritative tap of Grandma B's cane on the hardwood floor silenced the room instantly. Everyone froze mid-breath. The matriarch of the Wilson family had heard enough. She slowly rose from her antique dining chair, violently batting away Calvin's instinctive reach to help her stand. She stood tall, an imposing figure wrapped in tailored cashmere, her face a mask of absolute glacial fury. You called her unstable? Grandma B repeated, her voice dripping with icy venom as she glared down at her cowering son. You tried to sabotage your own daughter's business, to feed your fragile, pathetic ego. Mama, please, Calvin begged, his hands raised in a gesture of panicked surrender. I was trying to guide her, I wanted her to be safe. You were trying to break her. Grandma B snapped, her voice echoing like a gunshot through the vaulted ceiling. Just like you let this fraudulent clown break our family trust. She jabbed her heavy, silver-handled cane toward DeAndre, who flinched and backed away until he hit the mahogany sideboard, knocking over a silver candlestick. Grandma B turned her piercing gaze back to Calvin, stripping away every ounce of his pride and leaving him completely exposed. I handed you a legacy, Grandma B stated coldly. My husband and I built the foundation of this family's wealth with sweat and blood, fighting through doors that were locked to people who look like us. We gave you everything, Calvin. We sent you to the best private schools. We bought your first law firm. We paved your entire road with gold, and what did you do with it? You used it to play God. You used it to spoil one child who has absolutely no spine, and to terrorize another child who has more grit than you will ever possess. Valerie tried to intervene, tears completely ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark, muddy streaks down her cheeks. Beatrice, we are family, we can fix this. Valerie cried out. DeAndre will find a way out of the bankruptcy. Or we can sell some assets, we can downsize the cars. We just need a little help to get through the month, until the dust settles. Help? Grandma B scoffed, looking at Valerie as if she were a roach stuck to the bottom of her shoe. You forged a legal document to extort a sick child. You mortgaged the home I helped you buy to bail out a criminal. There is no fixing this, Valerie. You are entirely bankrupt morally and financially. You are a disgrace. She turned her back on her weeping daughter-in-law and faced Calvin, delivering the final, fatal blow to his ego. Listen to me very carefully, Calvin. As of this exact moment, you are no longer the executor of the Wilson Family Trust. Tomorrow morning, My attorneys will officially remove your name from every single account, holding company and property deed associated with my name. You are entirely on your own, do not call me, do not ask me for a dime. Calvin slumped back in his chair, utterly defeated. I picked up my vintage leather tote bag from the floor. I slipped my tablet inside and zipped it shut with a satisfying final click. Well, I said cheerfully, breaking the heavy, depressive silence. This has been an incredibly enlightening holiday dinner. But before I leave, there is one last piece of business we need to address. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope, with the Vanguard Urban Holdings corporate seal stamped on the front. I tossed it casually onto the mahogany table. It slid across the polished wood, coming to a stop directly in front of my mother. Valerie stared at it, her hands shaking. What is this? I told you earlier that the bank didn't own the toxic debt on this mansion anymore, I reminded her, offering a slow, deadly smile. I wasn't bluffing. Vanguard Urban Holdings specializes in acquiring distressed commercial debt portfolios from national banks at a massive discount. And yesterday afternoon, my firm purchased a bundle of high-risk commercial mortgages in the Atlanta area. Calvin looked up, his eyes widening in sheer unadulterated horror as the realization finally hit him. You, Calvin gasped, unable to form a complete sentence. Yes, Dad, I replied, my voice ringing with absolute victory. I own the mortgage to this house. Vanguard Urban Holdings is now your primary creditor. And since you have officially defaulted on your payments, that envelope contains your formal 30-day eviction notice. The room erupted into panicked, hysterical screams. Valerie tried to tear the envelope in half, but her hands were shaking too badly. Chloe collapsed onto the floor, weeping into her hands. DeAndre simply stared at the wall, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his destruction. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I didn't look back. I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. I stepped out of the massive front doors into the crisp, cool night air, feeling completely, utterly free. Never let toxic people convince you that your silence is weakness. Sometimes, silence is just the sound of someone quietly building an empire. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Drop a crown emoji in the comments if you believe in walking away from toxic family members and building your own legacy. Hit the like button, subscribe for more stories of ultimate revenge, and remember, the best revenge is massive, undeniable success. See you in the next video.